Derge and welcome to Tibet This Week, a weekly news edition on Tibet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Central Tibetan Administration. Let's have a look at today's headlines. His Holiness the Dalai Lama gives customary discourse on the Day of Offerings. Central Tibetan Administration condemns brutal suppression of peaceful Tibetan protesters in Dege. 9th International Conference of Tibet Support Groups concludes successfully. Tibetan leadership attend launch of Trichen, Gungthang, Jampelyang, Tenpai, Wangchuk's Biography in Belgium. Sikyong Tsering addresses members of Tibetan community in Amsterdam. Annual meeting of representatives of Office of Tibet convenes in Hoi. Parliament House of Victoria hosts exhibition cum Tibetan New Year celebration event. Deputy Speaker Dolma Teykhang inaugurates exhibition on Tibetan self-immolation. Potential future course for Tibet-China conflict resolution discussed at Sino-Tibet Youth High Tea. On the 15th day of the Tibetan New Year and the culmination of the Great Prayer Festival, His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave his customary discourse on the Day of Offerings to around 8,000 people, Tibetans, people from Himalayan region and foreigners at the courtyard of Tsuklakang, the main temple, on February 24th. His Holiness during his address said, "The more people employ reason and logic, the deeper will be our understanding of Buddha's teaching." He reiterated that thinking through what we have learned over and over again is very powerful. The combination of study and analysis that underlies the Nalanda tradition, he stated, is one of the world's treasures. As customary on the Day of Offerings, His Holiness the Dalai Lama read one of the Jataka tales that recall Buddha's Shakyamuni's previous lives. Tibetan leaders in exile and Tibet supporters are alarmed by reports about an ongoing major crackdown on Tibetan protesters in the eastern Tibetan area of Dege, where local Tibetans, among them Tibetan Buddhist monks, have non-violently protested against a dam construction project on the Dege River on the upper reaches of Yangtze. The construction project would force the relocation of two villages, Abo Winto and Shiba, home to about 2,000 residents, and result in the demolition of 6 historic monasteries: Windu Monastery, Yena Monastery, Kardo Monastery, Rabde Monastery, Gonsa Monastery, and Tashi Monastery. These monasteries house irreplaceable Buddhist relics, including ancient murals from the 13th century at Windu Monastery. Reports indicate that more than 1,000 Tibetans have been arrested for participating in peaceful protests against the construction of a dam on the Dege River. Sikyong, the president of the Central Tibetan Administration, said the crackdown on non-violent protests in Dege is beyond condemnation and said the Chinese authorities' disregard for the rights of Tibetans is unacceptable by any measure. Sikyong called on the Chinese government to release all those detained and to respect the rights and aspirations of the Tibetan people. The Tibetan parliament in exile also calls for the immediate release of detainees, an immediate halt to the dam construction, and respect the will and desires of the local people for any projects in the region. In Geneva, Switzerland, in the lead-up to the 55th session of the Human Rights Council, which began on Monday this week, around 45 members of the Tibetan community of Switzerland and Liechtenstein held a peaceful protest before the Palace of Nations to call for an immediate halt to the recent clampdown in Tibet's Dege County. The protest was joined by Jack Arnold, a member of the Swiss-Tibetan Friendship Association's Board of Directors, along with the former Tibetan parliamentarian Ngawa Gelsen Gelshonsang, Secretary Phunso Topke, and Tenzi Chösang from the Tibet Bureau in Geneva, and President and Executive members of the Swiss and Liechtenstein Tibetan Community Association. The 3-day International Conference of Tibet Support Groups, which was facilitated by the Office of Tibet Brussels and the Department of Information and International Relations, concluded successfully on 25th February. During the closing ceremony, Speaker Khenpo Sonam Tempel of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, Kaulon Nozirom of the Department of Information and International Relations, and Senator Ostoche Bruneau, chair of the French Parliamentary Group for Tibet, delivered speeches sharing their insights and perspectives. Speaker Khenpo Sonam Tembel in his keynote speech stressed that issues pertaining to Tibet need to be addressed on a deeper level than politics because they affect the survival and maintenance of Tibetan culture, which is based on compassion and non-violence. Senator Jacqueline Eustache-Brugnot, who also served as the president of the French International Information Group on Tibet, in a valedictory speech highlighted that the Chinese authorities continue to undermine the three main pillars of Tibetan identity: religion, language, and culture. She reaffirmed her commitment to speak on Tibet and Tibetans in France. In a concluding address, Khalun Nozudoma of the Department of Information and International Relations emphasized the importance of the 9th International Conference of Tibet Support Groups as a symbol of the continued relevance of the Tibet cause. Khalun thanked the participants for their expertise and resources to the Tibetans' struggle for freedom over the years. More than 170 Tibetan leaders and representatives of Tibet support groups from 42 countries have come together at the 9th International Conference of Tibet Support Groups to discuss ways forward in the Tibetan freedom movement. Following the 9th International Conference of Tibet Support Groups, Dr. Gyalo and his team marked the launch of the biography titled Siba Gube Chutin, dedicated to the 6th Gungthang Jampelyang Rinpoche, Jezun Jingme Tenpai Wangchuk, Pel Sangbo on February 25th. The Revered Rinpoche devoted his life to various facets of Tibet's religion, secularism, and education. The book launch was honored by the presence of esteemed guests, including Speaker Khenpo Sonam Tembel of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, Sikyong Tsering of the Central Tibetan Administration, Khalun Nozudoma of the Department of Information and International Relations, author Dr. Gyalo, Tibetan parliamentarians, representatives from the Office of Tibet, and members of the public. On Tuesday this week, after attending the 9th International Tibet Support Group Conference in Brussels, Sikyong Tsering arrived in Amsterdam for his official visit to meet the Tibetan community in the city. Later that day, Sikyong addressed the Tibetan community at the gathering and shed light on the middle way policy, the evolution of Tibetan democracy, and the priorities of Central Tibetan administration. After the community talk, Sikyong met and interacted with Tibetan youths, during which he emphasized the ecological significance of Tibet to Asia and the world in general. Over the next day, Sikyong had an interview with journalist Jamil from Brazil UOL News Media based in Geneva. Thereafter, Sikyong attended a luncheon-cum meeting with 16 different Tibet-related organizations in Netherlands, jointly hosted by the Office of Tibet Brussels, Tibet Support Group of Netherlands, and the Netherlands Tibetan Association. Sikyong expressed his sincere appreciation to all the representatives of the Tibet-related organizations for their steadfast and continued support towards the Tibetan cause. The Department of Information and International Relations of Central Tibetan Administration held a meeting of the representatives of the Office of Tibet at Kagyu Center, Yundeling in Huy, Belgium from 27th to 28th February. During the meeting's inaugural, Khalun Nozudoma, while speaking to the representatives, DIR Khalun emphasized that it is imperative to push for human rights violations and the persecution of Tibetan religion and culture inside Tibet in order to gain the support of foreign dignitaries, while applauding their efforts that have so far worked well. The Khalun implored representatives to continue their efforts, which have led to the passing of resolutions, the release of declaration by many parliaments in support of Tibetan cause, and Sikyong and Khalun's meetings with numerous notable members during their overseas visit in the respective countries. The two-day meeting was attended by 11 representatives, the coordinator of the Bureau de Tibet in Paris, and a Buddhist philosophy teacher from the Office of Tibet, Pretoria, along with additional secretaries and the accountant from the DIR. On Monday this week, under the leadership of the Tibetan community of Victoria, the regional VTAG members and Sam Hippins, a Greens member of the Victorian Legislative Assembly, organized an exhibition-cum-Tibetan New Year celebration at Victoria's State Parliament House. The chief guests of the event, Victorian parliamentarian Dr. Samantha Ratnam and parliamentarian Tim Reid, lauded the Tibetans' commitments and efforts to preserve their distinct heritages as China intensifies its persecution of Tibetan religion, language, and culture. President of the Tibetan community of Victoria, Dongshar Samdup, presented the dignitaries with a thangka containing His Holiness the Dalai Lama's message to appreciate the legislative members for their support towards the Tibetan cause. On Tuesday this week, Deputy Speaker Teykhang inaugurated the exhibition titled The Burning Question, Why Are Tibetans Turning to Self-Immolation, organized by Tibet Museum at the courtyard of Tuglakhang. Following the burning of a lamp in honor of the self-immolators and inauguration of the picture exhibition, the Deputy Speaker addressed the questions of media and highlighted the urgency of the situation in Tibet. The exhibition illuminates the aspirations of Tibetan self-immolators and features a map displaying the self-immolation sites across 3 provinces of Tibet. This exhibition also marks the 15th anniversary of the first Tibetan self-immolation in Tibet, Tabe from Kirti Monastery, who self-immolated on 27 February 2009. Tibet Information Office, in collaboration with the Chinese Alliance for Democracy, organized Sino-Tibet Youth High Tea in Sydney on February 25th with the active participation of over 20 youths from mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and local Tibetans. The program aims to create a platform of peaceful dialogue between Sino-Tibet youth and strengthen the civil connection. Chinese Liaison Officer of Tibet Information Office, Tawa Sangmo, in a welcome speech, emphasized the historical ties shared by Tibet and China and emphasized on His Holiness the Dalai Lama's guidance of peaceful conflict resolution through open dialogue to the ultimate way in moving forward. Dr. Jin Jiangtong, President of Chinese Alliance for Democracy, and To Tho Trung, Chairman of Sydney China-Tibet Friendship Association, the guest speakers, Professor Trung Yi Fong, Associate Professor of Chinese Studies at Sydney University of Technology, and Lobsang Yima, former Chinese Liaison Officer for Europe, gave talks on Chinese modern history, Tibetan culture preservation, and youth. That is all the news for this week's edition of Tibet This Week. Thank you for watching Tibet TV.